Hi everybody, how you doing? This is the Serverless Coffee Break with James. This is the No Dumb Questions edition. So for the last week, I've polled people for questions about serverless. Things they wanted to know the answer to, but were too embarrassed to ask because they thought they should know it already, or they're just things they just wondered about and never had the time to ask. So I'm going to go through as many questions as I can in 15 minutes. I got 32 questions. So this is going to be a push, but I'll give it a shot. So rapid fire, here we go. So number one, which runtime is best for Lambda? Well, it doesn't really have a preference for runtime. There's no inherent preference in Lambda for one runtime over another, but I can tell you that the most popular runtimes are Node and Python. Now, that's basically because they're easy to use scripting languages. They can be very fast to set up inside a Lambda function, but a lot of enterprises use Java. Java can be slower to start, but very rapid once it gets moving. I think the most important question for you when you're starting this is to decide what your team needs to use and make that the driving factor. But in terms of Lambda itself, it doesn't have a preference. When should I use S3 and when should I use EFS? So this actually comes up a lot, and they're very different systems. So fundamentally, with EFS, this is more like your hard disk. You can put operating systems on there if you wanted to, lots of files, whereas S3 is an object store. So this is really typically used for data that doesn't change that frequently. With S3, if you make a change to a file, you're essentially writing a whole new file as a separate version. There's also differences in durability. S3 is massively durable with 11.9. So they really come into different play. EFS is not something you can use with Lambda, remember, so S3 would be a better bet if you're pulling down large files for that use case. What will change in serverless in 2020? That's a great question. I get my crystal ball out. So with this, mostly what we're trying to do is help customers who are accelerating their usage this year, and they're figuring out features they want to see and anything else they want to plug together in terms of integration. So most of what we're working on at AWS is making the experience easier for people who are using it at scale. So you'll see lots more features coming through the pipeline that work with that. But in terms of what's changed this year, mostly it's just that more and more people are using serverless to solve all sorts of different problems. And so really, we're focusing our efforts on helping them as best as we can. I don't get how events are related to serverless. Why do I need events when I can just run code in a Lambda function? So events are really central to the way serverless works because Lambda functions don't do anything natively by themselves. Your code will sit there and not execute unless it's triggered by some form of event. So really the event could be an HTTP call or an S3 put or anything else in the ecosystem that generates events for you to react to. And so as we've started to plug these services and Lambda functions together, mostly this means we've come up with this idea of event-based compute, that when something happens, your code runs and we actually react to events. So you can use Lambda functions any way you like, but if you're building larger applications, you tend to find that you're writing custom code that responds to custom events. Isn't Lambda just a scheduler for Docker? Isn't it just an AWS branded Docker runner? No, actually, under the covers, Lambda doesn't use Docker. It's got its own proprietary system, and it's actually fairly different in many respects. So Lambda is designed to expose certain events that work within the ecosystem with other AWS services. So with Lambda, you can fundamentally just put some code in a handler and it will run. There's nothing you have to configure to make it work. It's actually a much more simple environment. And also the scaling happens automatically. So when you get lots of requests coming in, that scaling is all handled for you. It's not like you would have to manage lots of Docker containers or anything like that. Should I be using Serverless Framework or SAM? So this is a question I also get asked all the time, that what's better, SAM or Serverless Framework? Well, I think they both have different audiences and different use cases, and it's worth trying them both out to see what works best for you and your team. So Serverless Framework is something I've used extensively, has lots of plugins, really great platform, very, very easy to use. SAM is serverless application model, and that's a CloudFormation extension. So I would recommend taking a look at some of Eric Johnson's videos and tutorials on using SAM to show you how you can use it. But the most important decision you can make is to use a framework instead of trying to do everything through the console, simply because it makes developing applications in a production environment that much easier. Simon Wardley says containers and Kubernetes are just a blip in the history of software development and could soon become obsolete. Serverless is eating the world. What do you think? Simon Wardley has some interesting thoughts about where technology is going and the general trends. But I wouldn't say that containers and Kubernetes are a blip, because they're a technology that lots of people use. And AWS, we run lots of containers. We run about 80% of all the containers in the whole cloud. And we also know Kubernetes very well too. So that's really a side of the business for lots of use cases where customers are lifting and shifting out of their own on-premise environments into the cloud. Serverless also has its own use cases, and we have many customers who use both in different teams for different reasons. But I wouldn't say that it means that containers are going away or anything like that. And there's certainly no antagonism between the two. As with most tools, it's really about finding what's the most important tool for the job. I actually struggle with how to structure several Lambdas in order to make a complete ecosystem. I can write it for a task similar to functional programming, but conceptually, it's still mind-boggling. Yeah, so a typical application that you build serverlessly could have quite a few Lambda functions. We have internal applications that could be several hundred Lambda functions. So it becomes important how you coordinate and maintain all of those different functions. So when you first start in the console, it can be difficult to figure out how you would connect all these things together. So I think it's important to get away from the console fairly quickly and start developing things in your IDE where you can be using a framework like SAM or Serverless Framework to start bringing these things together. Now, when you're writing these applications, you're not just writing functions, you're writing resources as code. So you might have S3 buckets and DynamoDB tables and other resources that you need to use in your application. So when you start putting these all together and setting up the events that trigger these things, it becomes a bit more obvious how they're connected. Having said that, when you have really big applications, and we're talking about dozens and dozens of functions that talk to lots of resources, I think then it makes sense to start figuring out how you can split it up. And this is something that I really love EventBridge for, because if you have applications that develop over a series of months or years, you can start to build applications that extend the functionality, that just consume events from a main system, and they're really separate applications where there's 2 or 3 different functions by themselves, instead of building more and more monoliths. So part of this is about developing software architecture where you're not becoming monolithic. You don't want to build one huge application with hundreds of resources. And I think EventBridge can go a long way to helping you break apart those applications, making them simpler, more decoupled and independent. Do I really have to use DynamoDB? It seems really complicated. Can I use MySQL? So yes, you can. So with DynamoDB, we talk about a lot in serverless simply because you have a very, very, very fast system for accessing data, literally single-digit millisecond in many cases, and it goes to massive scale. So DynamoDB is really like the database of serverless of choice, and it's great for operational use cases. But it's not for everything. So DynamoDB doesn't help you with relational queries or for analytics or anything of that nature. So there's nothing stopping you using more than one database, especially when you consider how easy it is to spin these things up and how cost-effective it is. But if you just want to use a relational database like MySQL, that's fine too. You can use those in RDS. You can use RDS proxy to connect your Lambda functions through to your RDS database. And if you're comfortable with using those kinds of databases, there's nothing stopping you when you're creating Lambda functions. How does auth work with serverless? So this is a huge topic, and it's one that comes up fairly frequently. So authorization in a server environment, if you come from Python Flask or Node.js Express or anything like that, you're used to this token-based system where you have sessions on a server that are maintained by libraries like Passport. When you move to a serverless environment, it's all stateless. So the preferred method of managing auth is with JWTs, JSON Web Tokens. And by doing that, you have a much more stateless way of handling authorization throughout your application. So natively in AWS, we have Cognito, which can help you do this. And then also externally, there's Auth0. I recommend if you're first starting with this, take a look at Auth0 because they've got some really nice tutorials, very easy to use. And it'll give you a good sense of how JWT tokens can work. But the key difference is it moves away from this model where security is centralized around the server and one thing that's managing it to this very decentralized, stateless model. It makes it very easy to extend functionality. It's also very secure as well. What apps should I not use serverless for? So obviously not everything can be serverless. And so if you look at a lot of applications where there's very, very low latency requirements, like gaming platforms, or if you're building robotics factories like we have in the fulfillment centers at Amazon, those sorts of use cases are speed where you wouldn't use serverless technology. But what we tend to find is even in use cases where serverless isn't the natural fit, you tend to find you can use serverless for something. So often these systems have administration platforms or logging or reporting and other things that actually tend to be a very good fit for a serverless approach. So there's nothing stopping you bringing serverless into some part of your application where it makes sense, even if it doesn't make sense for the entire application. Generally speaking, we see people using it for web applications, for data processing pipelines, chatbots, Alexa, IT management. There's lots of different use cases. And the more you try to use it, the more you tend to find it fits quite broadly into lots of different categories. Why does the SDK version change in Lambda? So if you use the Lambda console and you try to invoke anything from the SDK, you'll see that sometimes the version of the SDK will change, or it may not match the latest version that you have out there. So we put the SDK in the console really for convenience, so that you can run code in the console easily without packaging up zip files or having dependencies. And so with this is really for people who just want to run a quick piece of code within the console. If you're building production applications, we highly recommend bundling a version of the SDK in with your code in your zip file. And this means you can have a completely immutable function. So if the function changes on within the Lambda console, that won't affect your own functions that are running code because they'll be using their own version of the SDK. So generally speaking, use the SDK in the console if it's just something you're just doing some quick test or development stuff. Anything for production, make sure you bundle the SDK into your own code. What are the best ways to learn serverless? Yeah, this again comes up a lot, and there's a lot of resources out there, a lot of really good stuff. So it can be difficult if you're new to this, trying to find and pick through what's really good. If you want to just try and get your hands dirty, we have a lot of workshops within AWS. You can find them all on GitHub. You don't have to attend an AWS led session or anything like that. Just go to GitHub, take a part of it in the workshop. Most of them you can do within the free tier or the minimal amount of cost to run. Also, if you really want to approach this and learn everything about it, there's courses by Cloud Guru that are very good too. And I've seen some work from Serverless Stack as well that I really like, lots of good articles there. Within the DA group, we produce lots of materials that hopefully help people. But I think as with lots of these technologies, it's really about just trying a few things, building some applications. And I think the workshops can be really good for that. I've written a workshop called Innovator Island, which is a theme park app you can run. Takes about 2 hours to walk through, but covers many of the key topics. And that's available on the GitHub repo and AWS samples. When should I use Amplify and what's Amplify console? So this is fantastic. So Amplify is fantastic for building web apps. If you're building anything where you've got a web application front end using React or Vue.js or anything like that, Amplify is a really good way to go. Makes it very, very simple to build out back-end infrastructure and integrate into your front end seamlessly. So we know a lot of people really love Amplify. If you're building things that are not a front end, then Amplify won't necessarily help you that much. Amplify console is a bit different. That's really hosting for your environment. So if you have applications that normally you'd put in an S3 bucket with CloudFront in front, whether it's just raw HTML or it's a SPA type application or something else, you can automate the steps with Amplify console. So that actually is not dependent on Amplify. You can use the two separately. I'm a huge, huge fan of Amplify console, so I highly recommend checking that out. And we're just coming up to our time. So I only managed to get through about a dozen or so questions, but I'll keep going through these and seeing if I can provide answers online for some of these too. If you have any questions or future topics for these talks, please just send me an email or drop me a DM or however you want. I'm available at jbezic@amazon.com or here on Twitter, and I'm happy to talk about any subjects on these Fridays. I'm a developer advocate with the serverless team, which means that I work for the Lambda team, but I'm basically here to advocate for what you, the developer, wants to see on our product. So anytime you want to see anything or you have an idea for a feature, let me know. I can make sure it gets to the right people within the Lambda team. Thanks very much for joining me today. I hope you all have a great weekend and tune in for next week. Take care.